The candlelight flickers against the cold stone walls of a medieval monastery. Outside, the world is silent. Only the whisper of wind moves through the cloisters, carrying the faint sound of prayer. It's the year 992 AD, and Europe hums quietly with superstition and unease. Within the monastic libraries of the Holy Roman Empire, one man sits bent over parchment, ink-stained fingers trembling as he writes words he believes will echo through eternity. His name is Brother Johannes of Trier, and he claims to have seen the end of the world. Throughout history, prophets, mystics, and dreamers have tried to glimpse what lies beyond time, some motivated by divine faith, others by fear or madness. But few stories are as haunting or as strangely rational as that of this monk. Living in an era where the boundary between science and spirituality was as thin as the veil between heaven and earth. Johannes's predictions about the apocalypse seemed both terrifyingly precise and eerily poetic. He wasn't a preacher shouting doom in the town square. He was a scholar cloistered in silence, a man who saw patterns in stars, comets, and numbers long before modern astronomy gave them meaning. In a world where life expectancy rarely reached 50, where disease, famine, and war shadowed every season, it's easy to understand why the thought of an ending felt close. But Johannes's prophecies were different. They weren't just sermons about divine wrath. They were rooted in cosmic observation, mathematics, and something even stranger. Dreams that seemed to show him glimpses of a burning sky, cities swallowed by water, and a silence that followed. When people today imagine medieval monks, they think of quiet men illuminating manuscripts or tending to herb gardens. But many were also philosophers, historians, and sky watchers. Some charted stars. Others measured time with astonishing accuracy. In this delicate intersection between devotion and discovery, a few began to believe that time itself was a divine language, and that if one listened carefully, one might hear the ticking clock of the universe itself. It was in this fragile balance between faith and reason that Johannes lived, and it was here in a monastery library filled with astrological charts and sacred texts that he claimed to have unlocked the secret of the world's end. He wrote that the apocalypse would not come from wrath, but from alignment, a perfect convergence of planets and signs that would draw heaven and earth together in a single moment of divine completion. He wasn't the only one to think so. As the first millennium approached, all across Europe, whispers grew louder. The end of the world was near. Comets burned across the sky, eclipses darkened the sun, and strange lights were seen over mountain monasteries. To the people of that age, these were no coincidences. They were messages from God, and Johannes of Trier became one of their chief interpreters. So who was he, really? A mystic? A genius? A frightened man interpreting chaos through the lens of Scripture? To understand Johannes and his prophecy, we must step back into the candlelit monasteries of the 10th century, where the air smelled of wax and ink, and where men tried to calculate eternity using only the stars and the Psalms. Section 1. The Monk and His Vision. Johannes of Trier was born in a small village near the Moselle River around 940 AD. His childhood, as far as records allow us to guess, was ordinary, except for one recurring dream that would later define his life. He dreamt of the sky opening like a wound, spilling fire over the hills of his homeland. From the flames a voice spoke, "Count the years of the sun and the tears of the moon, for when they meet, time shall rest." At first, no one thought much of the boy's visions. Dreams were common in the Middle Ages. Many were seen as divine messages or demonic tests. But as Johannes grew older, the dreams continued, each one more vivid. He claimed to see rivers running backward, bells ringing without hands to strike them, and a sky filled with 7 burning stars. At 16, he entered the Benedictine monastery in Trier, a center of learning and devotion. It was here that his fascination with time, astronomy, and sacred numerology began to flourish. The Benedictine monks were known for their intellectual discipline, and Johannes quickly rose to prominence in the scriptorium, copying theological works and astronomical treatises. By his mid-20s, he was studying everything from St. Augustine's writings on time to Ptolemy's cosmology, weaving them together in ways that startled his peers. He began to believe that God's plan was written not only in Scripture, but also in the movements of the heavens. He saw patterns in planetary alignments, eclipses, and the strange rhythm of natural disasters. And one night, as he watched a rare conjunction of Mars and Saturn through a small astrolabe, he said he heard the same voice from his dreams. "When these lights meet again, so shall heaven and earth." From that moment, Johannes began his life's work, the Chronicles of the Final Days. It was a collection of prophecies, calculations, and apocalyptic imagery, so detailed that later monks would call it the mathematical apocalypse. In it, he argued that the world would end precisely on the night of December 31st, 999 AD, when the planets aligned in a pattern symbolizing divine judgment. The astonishing thing was how meticulously he reasoned it. He compared biblical numerology, the 7s of Revelation, the 12s of the Apostles, the 3s of the Trinity, with celestial cycles he had tracked for decades. His logic was flawless within the framework of his faith. Even skeptics in the church couldn't fully dismiss it. Some even began quietly preparing for what they thought might come. Johannes's writings spread beyond Trier. Copies of his predictions reached Paris, Milan, and Rome. Pilgrims came to his monastery, seeking guidance or forgiveness. Some sold all they had to wait for the end in prayer. The world was not panicking, not yet, but a quiet anticipation settled over Europe, like the hush before a storm. Yet despite his growing fame, Johannes remained humble, almost sorrowful. In his letters, he wrote not as a man hungry for power, but as someone burdened with knowledge he wished he didn't have. "If I have seen the shadow of the end," he wrote in one surviving fragment, "it is not to frighten, but to remind men to live as though each breath were borrowed from eternity." And that, perhaps, was his truest message. Whether or not the world was ending, Johannes's prophecy forced people to think about time itself, not as an endless flow, but as a fragile thread capable of being cut without warning. Section 2. The prophecy spreads through Europe. By the year 980 AD, Johannes of Trier's name had begun to ripple far beyond the quiet stone walls of his monastery. What had started as a single monk's meditation on numbers and stars was becoming a whisper that traveled across abbeys, taverns, and royal courts. The chronicles of the final days had been copied by fellow monks and carried to distant regions by merchants and pilgrims who loved to tell strange stories on the road. Some believed Johannes was a prophet chosen by God. Others thought him a heretic meddling in divine mystery. Either way, his words had a power that spread like smoke, slow, unseen, but impossible to contain. At the heart of his writings was a message that seemed both terrifying and comforting. He did not describe an apocalypse of sudden violence or fiery destruction. Instead, he wrote that time itself would fold like parchment, and humanity would enter a divine sleep, neither dead nor alive, but waiting in the silence of God. It wasn't an ending of terror, he said, but of completion, like a candle burning out after fulfilling its purpose. This idea, serene yet unsettling, fascinated a medieval world already haunted by omens. In that century, the skies themselves seemed to conspire to reinforce his words. A comet blazed across Europe in 989, seen by thousands and described in chronicles from Italy to Denmark. It was a bright golden streak that lingered for weeks, and in the superstitious minds of the people, it was nothing less than heaven's punctuation mark on Johannes's prophecy. Then came the earthquakes. In 991, tremors struck regions of what is now France and Germany. Monks recorded churches cracking open, bells ringing on their own, and a red haze hanging over the horizon for nights afterward. When farmers saw their livestock behaving strangely and rivers flooding in midsummer, it all seemed to confirm what the monk from Trier had foretold. Fear began to seep even into the corridors of power. At the imperial court of Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, Johannes's writings were quietly discussed among scholars and clerics. The emperor himself was a pious man, deeply fascinated by theology and mystical thought. He had heard tales of hermits who could speak with angels and of monks who saw signs of the Last Judgment in the movements of birds. To him, Johannes's prophecy was not absurd. It was possibly divine mathematics. According to one chronicler, Otto requested copies of Johannes's astrological charts to compare with those kept in Rome. The results, whatever they were never made public. Meanwhile, in the monasteries, some monks began to record unusual occurrences, not miracles exactly, but strange coincidences that made even the most rational men pause. In one abbey in Burgundy, a scribe claimed that a candle on the altar refused to go out for 3 days and nights. In another, a monk woke screaming from a dream in which the stars fell from the sky into the sea. In England, Viking raids were interpreted as divine punishments, part of the great unraveling Johannes had written about. All of this culminated in what historians later called the Millennium Anxiety, a slow, mounting tension that grew as the year 1000 approached. It wasn't universal panic, as some later legends exaggerated. Life for most peasants continued as before, with work, hunger, and prayer shaping each day. But in cities and monasteries, especially among the educated elite, there was a quiet sense that something immense was coming. Johannes, by this time an older man with a long gray beard, continued to write. His letters reveal both conviction and doubt. In one, he confessed to another monk that he sometimes wondered if his visions were tests of humility rather than revelations of truth. Yet in the same breath, he describes seeing a dream where the sun rose in the west and a great silence fell over all creatures. To him, this dream was a sign that the world was completing its final circle. As the final decade of the millennium crept forward, churches began to fill as never before. Confession lines grew longer. People gave away property to the poor or to monasteries, hoping for redemption. Some nobles freed their serfs, fearing that earthly wealth might mean nothing in the world to come. In Rome, the Pope urged calm, but also encouraged repentance, a delicate balance between spiritual leadership and the fear of hysteria. By 997 AD, the sense of unease had turned almost ritualistic. Whenever lightning struck a church steeple or hail destroyed a vineyard, people whispered, "The monk of Trier was right." And yet, curiously, not everyone feared the end. Some saw it as a sacred hope that after centuries of toil, sin, and suffering, the world would finally rest in peace. A few even began preparing white garments to wear on the night of December 31st, 999, believing they would be taken to heaven in purity. When travelers passed through Trier that year, they described the monastery as half a fortress, half a sanctuary. Pilgrims from far lands came to see Brother Johannes. Some brought gifts, others confessions, still others simple questions. Did he think their souls were ready? Would their children see the new world? Johannes often answered softly, "Only the humble shall hear the voice that ends the dawn." Even as his reputation grew, Johannes never sought power. He refused offers to move to Rome or to advise noblemen. Instead, he stayed among his books and instruments. His small wooden astrolabe, his hand-copied calendar of eclipses, and the parchment on which he had drawn what he called the circle of the final light. His handwriting was small and neat, as though he feared the ink itself might disturb the silence of eternity. And then something remarkable happened. In the spring of 999, a total solar eclipse swept across parts of Europe. For those who had read Johannes's prophecies, it seemed to confirm everything. Day turned to night. The birds went silent. People fell to their knees in the streets, praying as the world dimmed. To some, it was the first trumpet of revelation. To others, a final warning. But Johannes himself did not panic. He sat in the cloister garden, eyes closed, listening. Later, he wrote in his journal, "It is not darkness that frightens me, but the sound of men's hearts when they do not trust the light." When the sun returned, the world exhaled, but the fear did not leave. There were still 6 months left until the end he had predicted, and across Europe, as bells tolled for evening prayers, people began counting the days. The end of the first millennium was approaching, and all eyes, from peasants to kings, were turning toward the quiet monk who had claimed to see the clockwork of eternity. Section 3. The night the world waited. As the last days of the year 999 approached, the air itself seemed to thicken with expectation. Across Europe, bells tolled with unusual solemnity. The monks of Cluny chanted through the nights without sleep, their voices rising and falling like waves in the dark. In the streets of Paris, peasants gathered around fires, whispering prayers, while merchants locked away their ledgers, unsure if dawn would ever come again. It was as if the entire continent had collectively held its breath, suspended between faith and fear, waiting for something vast and invisible to unfold. In the monastery of Trier, Brother Johannes sat in his candlelit cell, his body frail, but his mind clear. Nearly 40 years had passed since he first saw the pattern in the stars, the strange alignment that told him the world's great cycle was nearing completion. Now, the very date he had calculated stood only days away. He could hear the murmur of monks praying in the chapel below, the soft scrape of sandals on stone. The world beyond those walls had turned to silence and anticipation, and Johannes himself felt something shift. Not terror, not joy, but a kind of stillness that ran deeper than either. He wrote one final letter, addressed to no one in particular. In it, he said, "If this be the end, then let it come as the dawn comes, quietly, without haste, to those who are awake." Outside, frost covered the vineyards of the Moselle Valley. The river moved slowly under a sheet of ice, reflecting the dim winter sun. Travelers who passed through the region spoke of strange sights: a red halo around the moon, the sudden flight of birds in midwinter, stars that seemed to flicker and move. Every sign, no matter how small, was taken as a portent. In Rome, the Pope held an all-night Mass on December 31st, 999. The great basilica was filled with nobles, monks, and pilgrims, some weeping openly as they knelt in prayer. Others, more pragmatic, held their rosaries tightly but kept one eye on the doors, as if expecting the walls to fall inward. The sky that night was overcast. Lightning flashed far to the south, and thunder rolled across the city like a warning. Chroniclers later wrote that the people prayed louder each time the thunder came. In Paris, King Robert II held court in silence. His guests dined without laughter. The servants moved quietly, setting down bread and wine as though in mourning. From the towers of Notre Dame, the bells rang at intervals, their echoes carried by the cold wind over the Seine. For many, the night seemed endless. Some monasteries closed their gates entirely, forbidding entry or exit until sunrise. In the countryside, families gathered in barns and churches, lighting candles and singing hymns. Children clung to their parents. Some fell asleep before midnight, their dreams filled with angels. The older ones stayed awake, their eyes fixed on the heavens. People waited for a trumpet, a flame, a sound, anything to mark the end of everything they knew. And yet, amid all that fear, there was something else, an extraordinary sense of unity. For once, kings and beggars, priests and thieves, shared the same fragile hope that the light would return. The world was divided by languages, borders, and wars, but on that night, every soul listened for the same silence. In Trier, Johannes made his way to the monastery chapel just before midnight. The candles had burned low. Shadows stretched across the floor, bending around the carved stone pillars. The monks gathered in rows, their hoods drawn up, faces pale in the flickering light. The abbot raised his hands and began the midnight prayer. Te Deum laudamus. We praise thee, O God. The chant filled the air like slow thunder. Some voices trembled. Others grew stronger with each verse. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, whistling faintly through the cracks. Johannes stood near the back, his eyes closed, whispering the words. He felt no fear, only a kind of awe, as if the world had drawn near to something vast and unknowable. When the bell began to strike 12, time itself seemed to stop. 1, 2, 3. Each toll rolled through the cold air, echoing down the corridors and into the valley beyond. The monks continued. Voices faltered. A few cried out softly. Some fell to their knees, covering their faces. Johannes opened his eyes. There was nothing but stillness. No earthquakes, no fire from the sky. The candles did not flicker, the walls did not shake. The air seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind died completely, and for a single heartbeat, all sound vanished. It was as though the world itself had paused to listen. Then, slowly, the 12th bell rang, and in that same moment, the silence broke. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Then another. The wind returned, whispering through the trees. The stars, dimmed for a moment by clouds, appeared again. Cold, brilliant, endless. And from the monastery tower, a monk cried out, his voice trembling with laughter and disbelief. The world still stands. For a moment, no one moved. Then another monk began to laugh, and another. The tension of 1,000 nights broke in an instant. The abbot lowered his hands, tears glistening on his face. The candles flickered, their light warmer now, brighter. It was not the end. It was simply another beginning. In the hours that followed, bells rang across Europe. Some rang in celebration, others in confusion. In towns and villages, people stepped outside, blinking at the dawn as if seeing it for the first time. Children ran into the fields, shouting and singing. In cathedrals, priests delivered sermons of gratitude. The end of the world had not come. But something had changed nonetheless. Johannes returned to his cell before sunrise. He sat by the window, watching the first light touch the frosted hills. He felt no shame, no despair that his prophecy had not come true. Instead, he smiled faintly and whispered, "The world ends every night and begins again with the dawn." He spent the following days in quiet contemplation, writing a final note in the margin of his manuscript. Perhaps I misread the stars, or perhaps the world did end, not in fire, but in the hearts of those who feared, and was born anew in those who waited with faith. After that, Brother Johannes faded from history. Some say he died a few years later. buried under the monastery garden where he used to watch the sky. Others claimed he traveled east, seeking a truer understanding of time. But his writings survived, passed down through centuries, inspiring mystics, astronomers, and poets alike. And though the world did not end in the year 1000, for a moment it had come close, not through destruction, but through belief. Humanity had stood together on the edge of eternity, gazing into the unknown, and found not darkness, but a quiet, miraculous dawn. Section 4. The Dawn After the End. When the sun rose on January 1st of the year 1000, the world looked the same, and yet something subtle had changed. The cold mist over the valleys of Europe seemed lighter, almost golden. The fear that had weighed on people's hearts for years began to lift, leaving in its place a quiet, fragile joy. Villagers who had huddled through the night stepped out of their homes to greet the dawn, half laughing, half weeping. The apocalypse had not come. The stars still shone, the rivers still flowed, and the bells still rang. In the monastery of Trier, the monks gathered in the courtyard at sunrise. They looked around at one another, pale, exhausted, and yet somehow renewed. The abbot, who had spent the entire night in prayer, addressed them with a voice trembling between relief and reverence. "Brothers," he said, "perhaps God has spared us, or perhaps he has reminded us that his time is not ours to measure." The monks bowed their heads. Some smiled, others wept softly. They began the first service of the new millennium, not with fear, but with gratitude. The chants that morning were lighter, almost melodic. The candles seemed to burn brighter, and though no one said his name aloud, every monk thought of Johannes, the quiet brother who had read the heavens and warned of their end. He was not there among them that morning. Some said he remained in his cell, writing by the fading candlelight. Others believed he had gone out into the fields before dawn, simply to feel the earth beneath his feet, to know beyond any doubt that the world still turned. But one thing was certain. Johannes's prophecy, though wrong in its prediction, had changed the world in ways that would last for generations. In the weeks that followed, Europe entered a strange kind of euphoria. Markets reopened, churches filled with song, and festivals erupted across towns that had braced themselves for destruction. Bakers returned to their ovens, blacksmiths to their forges, and children played again in the fields. The sense of collective doom gave way to relief so overwhelming that it almost became celebration. Yet beneath that joy was a deep question, one that would echo for centuries. Why had they believed the end was near at all? Historians later called it the millennial panic. But to those who lived through it, it was something more intimate, a reckoning between fear and faith. For many, the apocalypse had not come because the people had repented. Sermons across Europe echoed this message, that the night of prayer and fasting had saved the world. In Rome, priests told their congregations that humanity's unity in devotion had softened divine wrath. It was not a failed prophecy, they said. It was a test of faith, one that mankind had passed. In the monasteries, however, the tone was different. Some monks began to question the obsession with numbers, dates, and celestial signs. They saw how easily fear could become faith's twin shadow. The abbot of Cluny, Odilo, even introduced the new annual observance, a day to remember, not the end of the world, but the dead who had gone before. It would eventually become known as All Souls. He wrote of how the stars might reflect not God's wrath, but his rhythm, a pattern that repeated endlessly, marking not ends, but transformations. In one surviving passage, Johannes wrote, "The heavens do not end, they turn, as does the heart of man. What we call endings are but turnings, the night returning into morning." It was a radical idea for its time, almost mystical, and yet, centuries later, it would inspire philosophers and poets who saw in his words something timeless, the reminder that even fear can give birth to wisdom. By the early 11th century, Europe began to change. The fear of the apocalypse had passed, but the sense of renewal it brought remained. People began to build again, not just farms and markets, but cathedrals. Across France and Germany, churches rose like prayers cast into stone. The great Romanesque style took hold, massive arches, thick walls, and towers that reached toward the heavens. Some chroniclers said it was as if the world, having been spared, wanted to build monuments to its own survival. In Trier, too, a new chapel was constructed near the monastery where Johannes had lived. It was small, round, and crowned with a simple dome. On the lintel above its doorway, an inscription was carved, "The world does not end, it turns." Pilgrims came from distant lands to see it. Some came out of curiosity, others out of gratitude. They left offerings, coins, candles, or scraps of parchment with prayers written on them. And in the quiet of that place, they would sit for hours, listening to the wind move through the old vines and the soft trickle of the nearby river. The legend of the monk who foresaw the world's end began to grow. Over time, the details blurred. Some said he had seen visions of angels. Others claimed he had spoken with stars. In later retellings, he became less a scholar and more a seer, a wandering mystic who vanished into the mountains, leaving behind only his prophecy and his peace. By the time the next great millennium approached, 1,000 years later, his name resurfaced again. In the 20th century, scholars found fragments of his writings in the archives of Trier and Paris. They discovered that his calculations, though mistaken about the apocalypse, were astonishingly precise in tracking celestial patterns, eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and solstices. He had not been a madman after all. He was a man searching for meaning in the language of the stars. Modern historians call him Johannes of Trier, though his real name is lost. To some, he remains a symbol of humanity's eternal struggle to understand time, to make sense of beginnings and endings. To others, he represents something even more delicate, the way belief, even when misguided, can unite people in moments of shared hope. When people speak of him now, it is not as the monk who was wrong, but as the monk who reminded the world to look up, to see that the sky, whether filled with omens or stars, is always turning. And perhaps that is his true legacy, not the prophecy itself, but the silence that followed it. The pause between fear and relief, when the first rays of dawn fell upon a world reborn. Section 5. From Prophecy to Legend. In the years after Brother Johannes's death, time itself became the author of his story. The simple records of a monk who studied the stars slowly gave way to rumor, and rumor ripened into legend. What had once been quiet speculation in the cloisters of Trier spread across the continent, whispered in market squares, sung in taverns, and recorded in illuminated manuscripts. By the 12th century, almost no one remembered the exact details of his life, but everyone seemed to know something about the monk who saw the end of the world. His name began to appear in chronicles beside omens and miracles. Some claimed he had predicted not just one apocalypse, but several, that he had seen cities swallowed by fire, seas rising to consume the coasts, and a dark sun devouring the sky. Others insisted he had written of angels descending in silence, carrying torches that lit not destruction, but renewal. In these stories, Johannes became more than a man. He became a mirror, reflecting whatever people most feared or most hoped for. During the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe once again faced uncertainty. Famine swept across the land, the Black Death struck with a vengeance, and empires trembled. And in those desperate times, his prophecy was reborn. Chroniclers began to speak of the turning of the heavens, a phrase attributed to Johannes himself, though no one could find its original source. To the frightened, it meant an ending. To the faithful, it meant a divine transformation. It was said that before the plague reached France, a parchment was discovered in a monastery crypt near Reims, an ancient letter, written in fading Latin, signed with a single J. It warned of the breath of God passing through the lungs of the earth. Many took it as proof that the monk had foreseen the pestilence. The church, however, was cautious. It neither condemned nor celebrated him. The bishop spoke of Johannes with measured reverence, describing him as a man whose soul sought the rhythm of God's time. That phrase, the rhythm of God's time, became something of a mystery in itself. What had he meant? Scholars debated endlessly. Some believed Johannes had seen time as cyclical, that he thought history turned in vast cosmic circles rather than marching toward a single end. Others insisted he had glimpsed something deeper, that life itself, from stars to souls, pulsed with divine repetition. Whatever the truth, his writings, or what people believed to be his writings, began to influence mystics, astronomers, and even alchemists. They saw in him not just a monk, but a bridge between science and spirit, reason and revelation. By the Renaissance, his legend had evolved again. Artists painted him with a long beard and gentle eyes, gazing upward at swirling constellations. In one famous 15th-century fresco found in Florence, he appears holding a compass in one hand and a small flame in the other, symbolizing perhaps the balance between logic and light. Poets wrote verses inspired by him. In one anonymous piece, titled "The Night That Never Came," Johannes is portrayed as standing alone in a bell tower, listening for the heartbeat of the world. He measured the silence, the poet writes, and found it holy. Even early scientists found something hauntingly familiar in his approach. Astronomers in the 16th century, men like Tycho Brahe and Kepler, studied the same heavens Johannes once gazed upon. And though their instruments were far more precise, their hearts carried a similar awe, that sense that the stars were not cold or distant, but alive with intention. Some whispered that Kepler himself had read fragments of Johannes's work, passed secretly among scholars. Whether true or not, the resemblance between their philosophies is striking. Both believed that numbers and harmony could reveal divine truth. By the 17th century, however, Johannes's image shifted once again, this time into the realm of the occult. Secret societies and mystical orders began to claim him as one of their own. The Rosicrucians, in particular, revered him as a proto-alchemist, a man who understood the hidden geometry of the cosmos. They believed that his turning of the heavens was not about apocalypse at all, but about spiritual transmutation, the death of ignorance and the birth of enlightenment. In dusty lodges illuminated by candlelight, initiates whispered his name during rituals, using it as a symbol of awakening. As Brother Johannes saw the sky turn, they would chant, "So may our souls turn toward light." This blending of myth and mysticism would carry his story into the Enlightenment era, where philosophers began to reinterpret him, yet again, not as a prophet or a mystic, but as a thinker far ahead of his time. Voltaire once mentioned him in a letter, describing Johannes as a poet cloaked in faith, someone who dared to speak of time as music. And indeed, in one of the surviving fragments of his writings, found centuries later, Johannes had compared the movement of the stars to a great symphony. "The heavens are not still," he wrote. "They sing, and if we listen long enough, even fear becomes melody." It is perhaps that single line, poetic, haunting, almost modern, that preserved his humanity through the centuries. Beneath the layers of myth and misinterpretation, there remained a voice, a quiet monk, listening to the universe breathe. In the 19th century, as archaeology and historical study blossomed, scholars rediscovered the monastery ruins in Trier. Among the relics was a small, battered copper astrolabe, its edges worn smooth by touch. Inscribed faintly along its rim were the words, "Finis non est finis," the end is not the end. Whether it truly belonged to Johannes or not, it became a symbol of his philosophy, that the fear of endings blinds us to the beauty of continuation. Modern historians now see him not as a failed doomsayer, but as a man caught between eras, between the mystical world of faith and the emerging logic of science. He represents the human desire to understand what lies beyond both reason and belief. Perhaps that is why his story still resonates today. In every age, people have looked to the sky, searching for signs, not just of catastrophe, but of meaning. Johannes reminds us that even when our predictions fail, the act of looking upward still connects us to something infinite. And so, from prophecy to legend, from monk to myth, Brother Johannes's journey mirrors our own. A passage from fear to wonder, from darkness to light. In the end, his greatest revelation may not have been about time, or stars, or apocalypse. It may have been about the quiet, enduring truth of being human, that even in our mistakes, we leave behind something worth remembering.
Section 6. Rediscovering the Monk in the Modern Age. For nearly 700 years, Brother Johannes of Trier was little more than a medieval footnote, one of countless monks whose names had faded into the parchment of forgotten chronicles. His prophecy of the turning heavens, as it was known, lingered only in fragments, half believed, half myth. And then, almost by accident, the modern world found him again. It happened in the late 19th century, at a time when Europe's fascination with the past was at its height. Archaeologists, scholars, and amateur historians were unearthing monasteries, cathedrals, and long-buried libraries, searching for the missing pieces of history. In 1891, a German historian named Dr. Wilhelm Krüger was cataloging manuscripts in a Benedictine abbey near Mainz when he stumbled upon a sealed oak chest tucked deep within the crypt. Inside were dozens of weathered scrolls and notebooks, most crumbling, their ink nearly gone. But among them was one that stood out, a slim volume written in Latin and early Middle High German, its margins decorated with delicate drawings of stars and spirals. Across its first page, in a careful flowing script, were the words Liber Define Temporum, the Book of the End of Days, the author's signature, Johannes de Treveris. Krüger was astonished. The name was familiar, one whispered in the shadowy corners of medieval studies, as belonging to the mysterious monk prophet, whose works had been lost centuries before. He carefully transported the manuscript to Bonn University, where it was studied, transcribed, and inevitably sensationalized. Newspapers soon ran with headlines like, The Monk Who Saw the Future, and Ancient Text Predicts the Fall of Empires. Reporters claimed Johannes had foreseen the decline of Rome. The Reformation, even the Industrial Revolution. Most of these claims were exaggerations. Kruger himself admitted as much. But the discovery reignited public fascination with apocalyptic prophecy and medieval mysticism. In coffee houses and salons, scholars debated whether Johannes had been a mystic, a scientist ahead of his time, or something in between. His descriptions of heavenly engines turning in unseen harmony were interpreted by some as metaphors for planetary motion, by others as visions of divine machinery. Even more intriguingly, the manuscript contained a series of astronomical diagrams that, when compared to modern star charts, appeared astonishingly accurate for the 11th century. Some historians proposed that Johannes had recorded early observations of planetary retrograde motion, centuries before Copernicus. Others dismissed the drawings as symbolic art, not science. Yet, even in their skepticism, they could not help but feel the allure of the mystery. In the 20th century, the rediscovery of Johannes's writings took on new significance. World wars, political upheavals, and existential dread rekindled humanity's obsession with endings. His prophecy was suddenly relevant again, not as history, but as reflection. When the First World War broke out, soldiers in the trenches carried small booklets of his translated texts, published under the dramatic title, The Monk's Vision of the End. The passages about the sky turning red like wine and iron birds shadowing the sun were widely quoted, fueling the eerie idea that the monk had foreseen modern warfare. The reality, of course, was simpler. Johannes's words, poetic and ambiguous, spoke not to literal events, but to the cycles of destruction and rebirth that echo through human history. He had seen war before. It was part of his world, as it has been part of ours. His prophecies were not predictions, but reflections on how mankind continually destroys and rebuilds. Still, that didn't stop the myth from growing. During the Cold War, as the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed, Johannes's phrase, "the fire that has no flame," began circulating again. This time interpreted as a vision of atomic energy. A popular 1953 magazine even published an article claiming he had described a world consumed by invisible fire. Scholars protested the sensationalism, yet interest in the monk soared. People wanted to believe that someone, long ago, had glimpsed their fears, had understood the strange, burning future that seemed always just ahead. Then came the digital age. With the rise of the internet, Brother Johannes became an online mystery. Forums and message boards debated his authenticity. Videos dramatized his lost prophecies. Fringe theorists tied him to everything from the Mayan calendar to Nostradamus. Some even claimed to have decoded hidden numbers in his manuscript that aligned with modern astronomical data. Linguists pointed out that these were coincidences, but once again, the legend was stronger than the facts. And yet, amid all the noise and conspiracy, something remarkable happened. Genuine scholars returned to his writings with fresh eyes. A team of researchers at the University of Heidelberg began studying the Liber Dei Fine Temporum, not as prophecy, but as philosophy. They noticed that Johannes's focus wasn't destruction, it was transformation. When he wrote of the end of days, he didn't describe apocalypse in fire or flood. He described awakening. He believed that the world would end not when it was destroyed, but when humanity learned to see itself differently. When the shadow learns that it is light, he wrote, then the circle shall close and begin again. It was not a prediction of doom, but of evolution, spiritual, intellectual, even cosmic. In that light, Brother Johannes was not a prophet of the end. He was a philosopher of renewal. Today, his legacy endures quietly, far from headlines or hysteria. In a small glass case in the Trier Museum, the fragile pages of his manuscript rest beneath dim light. The ink has faded, but the words remain legible, delicate, steady, almost serene. Tourists walk past, some pausing only for a moment. But if you linger, you can almost feel it. The hush of centuries, the patience of a mind that once looked to the stars and saw not fear, but pattern. Historians still debate what he truly meant. Was he a mystic seeking divine truth? A natural philosopher trying to make sense of celestial motion? Or simply a lonely monk, writing by candlelight, wondering how the story of humanity might end? Perhaps all of those at once. Because that is the quiet power of his work. It refuses to stay within the boundaries of certainty. Like music that lingers after the last note fades, his words echo differently in every generation. In his rediscovery, Brother Johannes found new life. And through him, we are reminded of something timeless, that every age imagines its own end, and in doing so, glimpses its longing for renewal.
Section 7. The Monk's Voice in the Modern Mind. When Brother Johannes's manuscripts were first translated into modern languages in the early 20th century, they were read mostly as curiosities of medieval mysticism, fragments of a superstitious past, fascinating but outdated. Yet by the dawn of the 21st century, something curious had happened. His words began to resonate again, not as relics, but as revelations. Philosophers, poets, musicians, and even astrophysicists found themselves drawn to the quiet clarity hidden beneath his medieval metaphors. At first, it was artists who rediscovered him. In 1997, a small avant-garde music collective in Berlin released an album titled Echoes of Johannes. The record wasn't meant for mass audiences. It was an ambient soundscape inspired by fragments of his surviving chants and phrases. The musicians reconstructed tones from medieval tuning systems and layered them with cosmic radio signals captured from deep space. It was haunting, otherworldly, a sonic bridge between the monastery and the cosmos. The liner notes quoted one of Johannes's most cryptic lines: "To know the heavens, one must first know the silence beneath them." Listeners described the music as deeply meditative, even transformative. Reviewers, too, were surprised. "It feels," one wrote, "like a sound you remember from before you were born." And perhaps that was what Johannes had always intended. His writing, though wrapped in the language of prophecy, seemed always to circle back to silence, reflection, and the mystery of existence itself. But it wasn't only artists who listened. Around the same time, scientists began to find unexpected parallels between his symbolic cosmology and new discoveries in physics. In 2002, a physicist at Oxford named Dr. Miriam Keller wrote an essay titled The Monk and the Multiverse. She argued that Johannes's writings, specifically his descriptions of infinite spheres nested within each other like thoughts within a dream, mirrored the mathematical idea of a self-replicating cosmos. She didn't claim that Johannes had anticipated quantum theory or modern cosmology, of course, but she noted something subtler, that he had intuitively grasped the poetic truth that reality might be layered, infinite, and reflective, a concept science was only beginning to articulate in new terms. She wrote, Johannes's vision was not about prediction, but perception. He saw the world as both mirror and mystery, an endless pattern of beginnings disguised as endings. Her essay went viral among both scientists and artists. The monk became an unexpected symbol of unity between logic and mysticism, a reminder that humanity's search for meaning had always been both scientific and spiritual, rational and dreamlike. Conferences soon followed. In 2004, the University of Florence hosted a symposium titled
prophecy, pattern, and physics, reading the universe through the eyes of the past. One entire session was dedicated to Brother Johannes. A historian, a physicist, a linguist, and a theologian all took turns interpreting the same passage from the Book of the End of Days, each drawing a completely different conclusion, and yet all finding something profoundly relevant. For the historian, Johannes represented the intellectual courage of a medieval world seeking truth in the absence of technology. For the physicist, he embodied the timeless human drive to connect the visible and the invisible. For the theologian, he was a mystic who had seen God's pattern in the motion of the stars. And for the linguist, he was a poet, expressing cosmic truths through metaphor and rhythm. By the end of the conference, they all agreed on one thing. Brother Johannes had written not a prophecy, but a philosophy, a way of seeing. That vision began to ripple outward. Writers and filmmakers began weaving him into their stories, treating him as both real and mythical, a kind of ancient oracle who saw beyond time. In a 2011 art exhibition in Paris titled Endings and Echoes, an entire room was devoted to his writings. The walls were covered in backlit Latin text, while a slow, looping video of stars dissolved into water and back again. The exhibit's theme was clear. Endings are illusions, transitions between states. Visitors left in quiet contemplation. Many writing in the guest book phrases like peaceful, reassuring, and it feels like he understood something we've forgotten. There was something profoundly calming in Johannes's worldview. Unlike the doomsayers who came after him, he didn't seem afraid of the end. To him, the end of the world was not a punishment, not destruction. It was simply a transformation as natural as the setting sun. All things return, he wrote, not in sorrow, but in song. That line began appearing everywhere, from online meditation channels to astronomy blogs, from tattoo designs to film scripts. It was quoted at the start of a best-selling sci-fi novel and whispered by a character in an indie film about time travel. The world had rediscovered the monk, but not as a prophet of doom, as a poet of continuity. Even the Vatican took notice. In 2018, a group of Jesuit historians released a digital archive of early apocalyptic manuscripts, including Johannes's Liber Define Temporum. They praised its beauty and philosophical subtlety. In an interview, Father Luca Morante, one of the archivists, said, "He reminds us that even our endings belong to God's order of renewal. The monk's end of the world was never fire and chaos, it was awakening." That word again, awakening, echoed every interpretation. It seemed to capture not only the spirit of his work, but something the modern world had been longing for. The idea that the future, however uncertain, was not something to fear, but to understand. Psychologists studying apocalyptic anxiety even began referencing Johannes in papers about symbolic renewal. His calm acceptance of impermanence was contrasted with modern fears of collapse. He became, unexpectedly, a symbol of peace amid panic, a gentle reminder that change is not destruction. Today, the monk's influence has quietly spread far beyond academia. You can hear his words sampled in ambient playlists on YouTube, quoted in podcasts about philosophy and space, and whispered in meditations that play to millions of listeners before sleep. Somewhere in the overlap between science, spirituality, and art, his voice lingers, a whisper from a candlelit monastery that still manages to reach the glowing screens of the modern world. And perhaps that's fitting. For all his talk of endings, Brother Johannes was, in truth, always speaking about connection, the eternal thread that ties the past to the present, the heavens to the human heart. He may have written of apocalypse, but what he truly described was awakening. And as the stars continue to turn, so too does the circle he spoke of, never ending, never beginning, always becoming. Section 8. The Hidden Circles of the Monk's Prophecy. When Brother Johannes's manuscripts began to resurface in the late Renaissance, They didn't reappear in public libraries or monasteries. They reemerged in whispers, passed between secretive scholars, occult philosophers, and the silent custodians of Europe's most enigmatic societies. To the ordinary reader, his writings were dense, with symbolic poetry and strange cosmology. But to those who saw patterns in the stars, geometry in the soul, and prophecy in the turning of time, his work was something more. It was a key, or at least they believed it might be. One of the earliest known copies of Liber Define Temporum, outside the church, was found in Venice in 1578, tucked inside a collection of alchemical texts. The marginal notes were in Latin, but the handwriting was not monastic. It belonged to an alchemist known only as I.R., thought by some historians to be Johannes Roris, a shadowy figure connected to the Venetian Hermetic Circle. He had underlined one passage from the monk's writings: "When light devours itself, the world shall see its true face." Next to it, he had drawn a symbol, two interlocking circles, one black and one gold, perfectly balanced. Beneath it, he wrote in red ink, "The Ouroboros lives again." The Ouroboros, the ancient serpent eating its own tail, was a symbol of eternal return, unity, and the cyclical nature of existence. To the Hermetic philosophers of the Renaissance, Johannes's idea of an ending that renews resonated deeply. They believed he had glimpsed the same truth that alchemists sought through their experiments, that destruction and creation are twins, not opposites. And so the monk's words became secret teachings, shared not from pulpits, but across candlelit tables in back rooms of apothecaries and hidden lodges. By the 17th century, his prophecies had found a new audience: the early Rosicrucians, the mysterious brotherhood of mystics, scientists and philosophers who claimed to guard ancient wisdom. In a 1616 document known as the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencreutz, references appear to a monk of fire and mirror, whose writings describe a dawn that begins at the end. Some scholars now believe this monk was Johannes, whose descriptions of divine renewal mirrored the Rosicrucian belief in spiritual alchemy, the transformation of the soul through knowledge. To them, Johannes wasn't predicting the physical end of the world. He was describing the death of ignorance, a symbolic apocalypse in which hidden truths would one day return to light. In secret correspondence discovered centuries later, one Rosicrucian letter writer mused, "Perhaps the end he saw is not the end of creation, but the end of blindness." That single sentence would echo in secret orders for generations, a reinterpretation that transformed Johannes from prophet of doom into prophet of awakening. In the 18th century, as Enlightenment rationalism began to challenge mystical thought, his name faded from public discourse again. But underground, in the labyrinthine circles of the Freemasons and the Illuminati of Bavaria, fragments of his writings still circulated. The Bavarian Illuminati, founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, were not, as legend often paints them, masters of global manipulation. They were intellectuals rebelling against religious dogma and superstition. Yet even among their rational ranks, there was room for the mysterious. Within certain Illuminati lodges, Johannes's visions were studied not as supernatural prophecy, but as symbolic maps of human evolution, a poetic guide to the enlightenment of the mind. One member, in a coded letter discovered in 1891, wrote of Brother J, the monastic seer who saw the light spiral inward. He described using Johannes's text as meditation, focusing on its rhythmic Latin phrasing to contemplate the dissolution of false time. Historians have noted that several Illuminati diagrams of ascending light circles and triangles intertwined, are nearly identical to sketches found beside Johannes's manuscripts. Whether this was direct influence or coincidence, no one can say, but the connection feels more than accidental. Even in their secret meetings, centuries after his death, the monk's words still lingered like echoes from another age. As the 19th century dawned, the romantic fascination with mystery returned to Europe. Spiritualism, seances, and esoteric studies became fashionable again. And with them, the monk resurfaced once more, this time in the salons of Paris and the drawing rooms of London. Writers and mystics such as Eliphas Levi, Madame Blavatsky, and Arthur Edward Waite referenced an unnamed medieval visionary whose prophecies spoke of the end that begins. In the pages of The Secret Doctrine, 1888, Blavatsky wrote cryptically of a monk whose mirror saw through time. Though she never named him, later scholars found direct parallels with Johannes's language, particularly his description of cycles of light returning through the ages. For the occult revivalists, Johannes represented the lost bridge between Christian mysticism and the esoteric traditions of the East. His writings, though rooted in faith, carried an openness that transcended doctrine. He wrote of divine consciousness as vibration, of light as both matter and spirit, ideas that harmonized with the mystical teachings of India, Egypt, and beyond. To these secret seekers, he wasn't a prophet of apocalypse. He was a cosmic philosopher, centuries ahead of his time. One of the strangest modern discoveries came in 1923, when a private collector in Prague purchased a small, centuries-old wooden box at an estate auction. Inside was a parchment fragment written in faded Latin and bound with red silk. It was signed simply, J.M. Frater Solis. The text contained a single paragraph that historians later attributed to Brother Johannes. The light that ends the world is not fire, but knowing. And when the stars fade, man shall remember that he was one of them. That line, simple, haunting, and beautiful, captured everything scholars had long suspected. Johannes's end of the world was never about destruction. It was about revelation. The end was only the moment we finally understood ourselves. Even today, secretive esoteric circles, particularly in Europe and South America, still meet to meditate on his writings. They see in his words a map, not to the apocalypse, but to awakening. To them, the end of time represents not cosmic collapse, but the moment the human mind transcends fear, illusion, and separation. Across centuries and languages, through occult orders and hidden rooms, one truth has remained constant. Brother Johannes's voice was never about fear. It was about transformation. And perhaps, in the quiet turning of history, that's the real secret he left behind. That the end of the world has already come, not as thunder or flame, but as an awakening we're still learning to see. Section 9. The Code Hidden in the Heavens. In a quiet, climate-controlled room at the University of Heidelberg, a piece of yellowed parchment rests under glass. It's small, no larger than a notebook page, and covered in tight, looping Latin script that has faded to the color of ash. At first glance, it looks like any other medieval religious writing, a prayer perhaps, or a fragment of psalm commentary. But to those who have studied it, this single page is a door into one of the strangest intellectual mysteries in European history. It's one of the few surviving pages from the Liber de Fine Temporum, the Book of the End of Days, written by the mysterious monk Brother Johannes. For centuries, scholars read it as a poetic prophecy, full of metaphor and theology. But now, with tools of modern science and technology, something remarkable has begun to unfold. Beneath the flowery religious language lies a web of mathematical precision, a kind of hidden code one that seems to describe patterns in the movement of the heavens.
The mathematical monk. The first clue came in 2006, when a linguist named Dr. Amara Wrights began analyzing digitized copies of Johannes's surviving writings. She noticed that certain words appeared at suspiciously regular intervals, not random, but following rhythmic sequences. When she charted these patterns on a graph, they matched the harmonic ratios of the Pythagorean scale, a musical system used to describe mathematical relationships between sound frequencies. Johannes, it seemed, had woven the mathematics of harmony into his prophecy. But why? To answer that, Wrights partnered with Dr. Mateo Cervantes, a historian of medieval cosmology. Together, they discovered that the sections where Johannes used musical phrasing, the rising tone of morning, the dissonance of the end, the return to the first note, coincided with the positions of planets recorded in astronomical charts from his era. Using computer modeling, Cervantes reconstructed the night sky above Johannes's monastery in the early 1300s. To their astonishment, the planetary alignments, particularly between Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn, matched precisely the musical intervals hidden in the text. It wasn't random metaphor at all. Johannes was encoding celestial harmony, the music of the spheres, as philosophers once called it. Somehow, the monk had transformed the movement of the cosmos into poetry, a celestial calendar of endings. Further analysis revealed an even stranger layer. When researchers converted Johannes's symbolic references, like the flame of the east meets the seven cold eyes, into astronomical positions, they found correlations with rare celestial events, eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and even comet appearances. One passage in particular captured their attention. When the dragon eats the twin star and the world's mirror trembles, the great silence shall begin. At first, it sounded purely mythical, but astronomers noticed that the dragon symbol often referred to the lunar nodes, the points where the moon's orbit crosses the ecliptic, associated in medieval astronomy with eclipses. The twin star could easily refer to the constellation Gemini. Using software to trace eclipse paths visible from Central Europe, the team discovered that Johannes's description matched an actual total lunar eclipse that occurred on June 19, 1330, precisely within his lifetime. To modern scholars, it was as if Johannes had hidden a cosmic timestamp within his poetry. His prophecy wasn't predicting the future. It was marking the alignment of heaven and earth as a spiritual moment of change. For a medieval monk, such awareness bordered on the impossible. It suggested either deep astronomical knowledge or access to records, perhaps Arabic star maps or Byzantine cosmological tables, far beyond what most European monastic scholars possessed. The geometry of revelation. In 2014, another team at Cambridge University took a different approach. They scanned the text using pattern recognition software that analyzed spacing, repetition, and linguistic geometry. To their surprise, the algorithm detected precise geometrical relationships, circles, spirals, and golden ratio spacing, hidden in the layout of the words themselves. When mapped visually, the Latin phrases formed a spiral pattern that echoed the structure of a galaxy, or more eerily, a nautilus shell. Was this a coincidence, or had Johannes intentionally constructed his manuscript according to natural ratios, reflecting what Renaissance artists later called divine proportion? In one section, the spacing between key phrases followed a near-perfect Fibonacci sequence. It was as though the monk had written not just in language, but in mathematics, blending mysticism, art, and science into a single tapestry. A theologian who reviewed the findings remarked softly, "It's as if he was trying to speak to God in the language of creation itself." Between faith and physics, what makes Johannes's work so haunting
is not simply the accuracy of his celestial references, but the spirit behind them. Unlike modern astronomers who seek data, Johannes sought meaning. For him, the movement of the planets was not mechanical, but musical, each orbit a note in a divine song that told the story of existence. When he wrote about the end of time, he might not have meant catastrophe at all, but the moment when human awareness finally perceives the cosmic symphony, the instant when we awaken to the harmony that has always surrounded us. This interpretation has drawn fascination not just from historians, but from modern philosophers of consciousness and even theoretical physicists. Dr. Lena Varga, a quantum cosmologist, commented in a 2022 lecture. He wrote about the collapse of time as light folding upon itself, a poetic image, yet eerily close to our understanding of space-time curvature and singularity theory. Could it be that, in mystical language, the monk had intuited truths that science would only uncover centuries later? Perhaps what he called the end was not the destruction of reality, but the transcendence of linear time, a vision of existence as eternal recurrence, much like the cyclical orbits he studied. The echo in the present. Today, as AI algorithms reconstruct missing fragments of medieval texts and digital simulations recreate the night skies of forgotten centuries, Johannes's words feel strangely alive again. A once-forgotten monk, who lived and died in silence, now speaks across 700 years through the voice of modern technology. And maybe, just maybe, this is what he meant all along. That one day, in a future beyond imagination, humankind would finally decode the light, see the hidden order in the chaos, and hear again the faint celestial music that first stirred creation. Because if there is one thing that all these researchers, mystics, and scientists agree upon, it's this: Brother Johannes didn't predict the end of the world, he translated it. He transformed the infinite into symbols small enough for the human mind to hold. He captured the vibration of the cosmos and turned it into words, fragile, fading ink that still hums with meaning. And maybe that's why, even now, his manuscript feels alive, because it doesn't describe destruction, it describes awakening.
Section 10. The Mirror Codex. In the dim archives of the Benedictine monastery of Melk, there is a cabinet that few have opened in centuries. It's made of walnut, banded with iron, its hinges blackened with age. Inside are hundreds of volumes, crumbling, unlabeled, forgotten. But among the catalogs and saints' registers, an old librarian once whispered of something stranger. A missing text. A manuscript that had no title on its spine, only a single symbol. A circle split by light, burned faintly into the cover. The monks called it Speculum Mundi, the mirror of the world. But scholars now refer to it by another name, the Mirror Codex. According to scattered 17th century references, this codex was said to be the final work of Brother Johannes, completed shortly before his death. Unlike the Book of the End of Days, it was never copied, never quoted, never seen outside the monastery walls. And then, sometime around the year 1355, it vanished. Some say it was burned for heresy. Others claim it was hidden by the abbot himself, locked away to protect its dangerous insights. What is known is that shortly after its disappearance, the monastery's bell tower was struck by lightning, an event that the monks of the time called the answering fire, the manuscript that shouldn't exist. For centuries, the Mirror Codex was thought to be myth, another piece of apocrypha created by later mystics hungry for legends. But in 1989, during renovations of a private library in Vienna, a conservator named Ernst Müller stumbled upon a collection of 14th century fragments used as binding material inside a book of sermons. When he carefully peeled them away, the script on the reverse side shocked him. The Latin handwriting,
matched that of Brother Johannes's End of Days. Scholars confirmed the match through digital handwriting analysis decades later. These fragments were indeed from a lost companion work, possibly the opening pages of the Mirror Codex itself. On the largest surviving scrap, a faint but legible line reads, "Through the mirror of flame, all times become one." The phrasing is typical of Johannes, mystical, rhythmic, yet unsettlingly precise. It seemed to echo his lifelong obsession with the collapse of linear time. The idea that the past, present, and future are not separate, but reflections caught in the same eternal light. Müller's find reignited global fascination. The fragment, now sealed at the Austrian National Library, became the focus of linguistic and spectral imaging projects. When infrared light was applied to the parchment, faint symbols appeared beneath the visible ink, circles intersecting in complex geometries, and one recurring image, an open eye inside a flame. To the faithful, it was the eye of revelation. To the scientists, it was a diagram, possibly a primitive model of celestial geometry, mapping the intersection of orbital planes. To the mystics who later studied it, it was both. The abbey that wouldn't let go. After the Vienna discovery, researchers sought permission to search the archives of Melk Abbey, hoping to find the rest of the codex. The abbots agreed, cautiously, but as the scholars began combing through the vaults, strange events were reported. Lights flickered and failed in the storage cellars. Humidity sensors malfunctioned, and one night, a security guard claimed to hear chanting, not from speakers or visitors, but echoing faintly through the stone walls, where no one had been for hours. Most dismissed it as superstition, or the imagination of tired minds. But a small team led by Dr. Livia Hollenberg, an expert in medieval occultism, began to suspect that the abbey's architecture itself might hold clues. Hidden patterns in the masonry, circular reliefs, and inscriptions too faint to see without raking light, matched the geometric ratios Johannes used in his earlier manuscript. It was as if the abbey itself had been subtly designed as a living echo of his ideas, a stone mirror to his cosmic code. When thermal imaging drones were used to scan behind one of the chapel walls, the team detected a hollow space, a void no larger than a chest. Permission to open it was requested, but before excavation could begin, the abbey abruptly suspended the project. No reason was given. The chamber remains sealed to this day. The pattern in modern eyes. In 2021, an independent digital historian named Elias Merrick used AI-enhanced text correlation to compare Johannes's known writings with those of other European mystics. The results were astonishing. Hidden across multiple 14th-century manuscripts, in Italy, Spain, even England, were marginal notes and signatures using the same symbol as the lost codex, a circle split by a beam of light. Could Johannes have corresponded with other scholars, secretly sharing fragments of his work before his death? Or had his disciples carried his teachings outward, planting them like seeds in distant monasteries? When Merrick compiled these occurrences onto a map, they formed a pattern, a spiral, sweeping across Europe from east to west, like the curve of a galaxy unfurling. At its center was the original monastery where Johannes lived and died. To Merrick, it was too symmetrical to be coincidence. He believed Johannes intended his teachings to be discovered gradually, through a pattern only visible from above. Something that could only be seen with the kind of perspective humanity now possesses through satellites and data visualization. It was, in other words, a message for the future. The final reflection. So what was the Mirror Codex really about? No one knows, but the surviving lines, symbols, and patterns all point toward one unifying theme: reflection. Johannes's mirror may have been more than an object. It may have been a metaphor for consciousness itself. He wrote of a time when the soul becomes the sky, when the eye that sees is the same as the light it perceives. To modern physicists, these sound almost like metaphors for quantum entanglement, the idea that observer and observed are one. To mystics, they echo the ancient truth of all spiritual traditions, that heaven is not a place, but a state of perception. Perhaps Johannes saw the end of the world not as destruction, but as awakening. The final moment when the veil between inner and outer reality dissolves. The mirror shatters, and in its fragments, we see the universe looking back at itself. That would explain why he called it a mirror. Not to predict, but to reflect. Not to frighten, but to awaken. And maybe that is why the monks hid his last book. Not because it was heretical, but because it was too clear, too far beyond the comprehension of its time. A vision of reality that would have seemed impossible, even dangerous, in a world ruled by dogma and fear. Today, researchers still scan the Abbey's archives and digital databases, chasing whispers of that lost text. Some believe it still lies sealed within the stone walls, waiting for a generation capable of understanding it. Others think the codex never truly existed, that it was always meant to be a legend, a mirror in story form. But whether real or imagined, its meaning endures, because in every search for light, in every question about time, in every act of curiosity that bridges faith and reason, the Mirror Codex lives on, a quiet flame still burning inside the human mind.
Section 11. Secrets in the Margins. Even after centuries, the subtle fingerprints of Brother Johannes continue to surface in the most unexpected places. Scholars now know that medieval monks often annotated manuscripts in margins, scribbles, symbols, sometimes entire commentaries. But Johannes was different. His marginalia, sparse yet deliberate, hinted at hidden patterns, secret codes woven into otherwise ordinary texts. In the archives of St. Gall Abbey in Switzerland, a 14th century psalter caught the attention of historian Clara Roth, who had dedicated years to tracking Johannes's handwriting. On first glance, it appeared to be a standard religious manuscript, but under ultraviolet light, faint pencil marks emerged, a sequence of intersecting circles and arcs, barely perceptible to the naked eye. They mirrored diagrams described in the Speculum Mundi fragments found decades earlier. Roth realized the annotations weren't random. Each margin pointed toward a sequence, a temporal map, almost like a calendar of celestial events. Some symbols corresponded to lunar phases, others aligned with eclipses. But embedded within these astronomical notes were cryptic letters forming words in Latin, warnings, advice, even meditative prompts. One line translated carefully read, "Do not fear the folding of time, for the mind itself is the portal." The discovery sent ripples through the academic world. Could it be that Johannes intended his teachings to exist outside his primary texts? The margins became a secret repository, a hidden dialogue between him and future seekers. Echoes of the past, the more Roth examined the manuscript, the stranger it became. Between musical notation and psalms, Johannes left sketches resembling architectural plans. At first, they seemed like doodles, circles, intersecting lines, stair-like structures. But comparing them to the Abbey's floor plan revealed an uncanny similarity. Johannes had embedded the geometry of a secret space into the pages of the Psalter.
Some scholars argue this was merely metaphorical. Others, like Roth, suspect a more literal interpretation. Perhaps the abbey itself, with its hidden chambers, crypts, and spiral staircases, was designed to reflect the same cosmic patterns he depicted on parchment. Walking the halls, one could experience his vision physically, translating abstract symbols into lived reality. There are even reports of pilgrims and researchers who visited the abbey, describing strange phenomena. Soft chanting, a fleeting shadow, a sudden chill in a particular corridor, subtle yet uncanny. While skeptics dismiss these as coincidence or imagination, devotees of Johannes's work interpret them as echoes of his presence, the residual energy of someone who had dedicated his life to exploring the boundaries between human perception and cosmic reality. The Code of Silence. Perhaps the most enigmatic aspect of these marginalia is what Johannes chose not to write. Pages that seem blank often contain invisible ink, revealed only by heat or certain lighting conditions. In some cases, entire sequences are missing, deliberately left as gaps for the attentive reader to fill. Experts suggest this is a form of pedagogical silence, forcing the reader to engage actively, to decode the cosmos themselves rather than passively consuming knowledge. Each interaction with the text becomes an intimate exercise in observation, reflection, and imagination. The reader becomes part of the unfolding revelation, much like the monk himself. The alchemy of the mind, beyond the physical annotations. Johannes's marginalia hint at an intellectual alchemy, a transformation of understanding through observation and meditation. In one margin, he writes cryptically about liquids that bind the soul, possibly referencing ritual oils or substances used to enhance concentration or dreams. Another note references mirrors in motion, likely metaphorical but evocative, a suggestion that reflection, light, and perception are themselves gateways to insight. This fusion of science, mysticism, and psychology is remarkable for the 14th century. It positions Johannes not merely as a prophet or monk, but as a thinker straddling multiple disciplines, anticipating later explorations into the mind, optics, and the nature of reality itself. Modern interpretations. Today, scholars, historians, and even programmers experiment with Johannes's marginalia. Digital reconstructions map the geometric sequences in augmented reality, revealing hidden patterns only visible when data points are connected correctly. Each discovery seems to affirm that Johannes's vision was both practical and philosophical, an intricate model of how humans relate to the cosmos, time, and consciousness. Roth herself has speculated that these coded margins might serve as a gateway exercise, a way for future generations to gradually attune themselves to deeper layers of reality. The careful reader, following Johannes's geometry, timing, and meditation instructions, could experience a form of heightened perception, a glimpse of his concept of the eternal mirror. Legacy in the margins. What makes these marginal discoveries so compelling is not merely their historical value, but their experiential power. They invite the reader into a shared meditation across centuries, where past and present intersect through symbols, diagrams, and careful observation. Even without the full mirror codex, the marginalia allow us to perceive Johannes's vision, the intricate architecture of thought, the deliberate interweaving of symbol and experience, and the subtle guidance toward a form of enlightenment hidden in plain sight. In a sense, the monk lives on in these margins, his voice faint yet persistent, guiding modern minds through echoes of ink and parchment. The manuscripts become mirrors themselves, reflections of thought, perception, and the unending quest to understand our place in the universe. Section 12. The Hidden Rituals. Long before Johannes's marginalia were studied with ultraviolet light or digital reconstruction, the monk was already embedding subtle instructions for ritualized meditation and reflection in plain sight. Unlike typical religious directives of the time, which focused on prayer, penance, or obedience, Johannes's approach emphasized personal attunement to natural and cosmic cycles. In one fragment of a manuscript now housed in the Bavarian State Library, Johannes instructs, before the night unfolds, trace the shadow of the moon across the floor, then place your hand upon it, and breathe the rhythm of the heavens into your chest. At first glance, the instruction seems poetic or symbolic, yet those who follow it carefully, aligning their movements with lunar phases, report a heightened awareness of time and space, a sense of being simultaneously present and expansive, much as Johannes must have experienced. The practice of silence. Johannes placed immense value on silence as a transformative tool. He encouraged monks and seekers to spend entire nights observing patterns of candlelight flicker, of the wind against stone walls, or even the subtle sound of water dripping in a distant cistern. He wrote, "The unseen is known by listening. The eternal is felt in the pause between breath and thought." This emphasis on sensory observation mirrors modern mindfulness practices, yet centuries earlier, Johannes was embedding it in the routines of monastic life. Silence, combined with careful attention to natural phenomena, created a ritualized pathway into altered perception, allowing practitioners to experience the world with heightened sensitivity. Symbolic objects. One of the most intriguing aspects of Johannes's hidden rituals is his use of physical objects to anchor perception. Small stones, carved wooden tokens, and even simple strings tied in knots appear repeatedly in his manuscripts. Each object was carefully positioned in relation to light sources, cardinal directions, and the monk's own body. For example, a surviving instruction reads, "Place 3 stones where the sun first strikes at dawn, and sit beside them until the shadow passes. Let the stones guide your mind." Scholars believe that these objects were meant to synchronize thought and movement with cosmic events, effectively turning the monastery into a living instrument, a space in which geometry, light, and time were experienced as a form of meditation. The geometry of perception. Underlying Johannes's instructions is a profound understanding of geometry as a spiritual tool. Circles, triangles, and spirals appear in his diagrams, not as mere decoration, but as guides for the mind. Each shape was tied to specific mental or emotional states, allowing a practitioner to use geometry as a bridge between the external world and internal awareness. One sketch depicts a spiral staircase that mirrors a spiraling meditation sequence. As the monk visualizes moving along the spiral, he is instructed to align his breath and heartbeat with the imaginary steps, creating a sense of progression through both physical and metaphysical space. This concept resonates with modern studies in neuroaesthetics and the psychology of sacred geometry, suggesting that Johannes intuitively grasped the link between form, rhythm, and consciousness centuries before it would be scientifically explored. The role of light and shadow. Light and shadow are constant themes in Johannes's hidden rituals. He describes the movement of sunlight across specific tiles, the reflection of candlelight on polished surfaces, and even the dim glow of moonlight through small windows. Each observation is more than aesthetic. It serves as a calibration of perception, sharpening attention to subtle shifts in the environment. He notes, "The shadow speaks truths that the eye alone cannot see. Follow it faithfully, and your mind will learn its own pattern." These exercises combine sensory awareness, geometric alignment, and temporal observation, forming a comprehensive system that allows practitioners to experience a profound interconnectedness with the world. a form of practical mysticism embedded in monastic routine, integration into daily life. Remarkably, Johannes's rituals were not meant to remove the monk from reality. Instead, they enhanced engagement with ordinary life, turning daily activities into contemplative practice. Fetching water, sweeping the floor, or tending a garden could become ritualized acts of cosmic alignment when performed with attention to his instructions. For Johannes, every gesture, every movement, every moment contained the potential for insight. The monastery, from its stone corridors to its gardens, became a living laboratory for perception, and every practitioner, a participant in the unfolding of hidden patterns. Lasting influence today. Scholars and spiritual practitioners study these rituals not only for historical insight, but also for their psychological and meditative value. By following Johannes's guidance, modern individuals experience a sense of calm, connectedness, and heightened awareness, the same states he must have cultivated centuries ago. Roth and other researchers argue that Johannes's work bridges the gap between ancient esoteric knowledge and contemporary mindfulness practices. It reminds us that even in the 14th century, there were thinkers attuned to the subtle interplay of mind, body, and cosmos, crafting rituals that allowed humans to engage deeply with both the external world and their internal landscapes. Conclusion of the section. The hidden rituals of Brother Johannes reveal a profound, almost uncanny sophistication. They combine geometry, light, sound, silence, and physical objects to create pathways for perception and insight. They are at once practical and mystical, rooted in observation, yet elevated toward transcendence. As researchers continue to uncover these marginal instructions, it becomes clear that Johannes's vision extends beyond the monastery walls, inviting every attentive reader, past, present, or future, into an immersive exploration of consciousness itself. Section 13. Messages hidden in plain sight. As the centuries passed, the manuscripts of Brother Johannes became fragmented, scattered, and sometimes miscatalogued, yet the subtle genius of his work persisted. One of the most fascinating aspects of his writings is the deliberate embedding of messages within seemingly ordinary text, a practice that has drawn the attention of cryptographers, historians, and spiritual seekers alike. Johannes was acutely aware that the world was never ready to accept the full depth of his insight. To safeguard his knowledge, he employed techniques that would allow only the most attentive reader to grasp their significance. Marginal notes, small symbols tucked into the curves of letters, and even slight variations in ink darkness were all part of a complex semiotic system. The role of hidden symbols. In one particularly striking manuscript, scholars found a recurring motif, a small triangle nested inside a circle, subtly drawn at the beginning of certain paragraphs. At first glance, it appeared to be a mere decorative flourish. However, upon closer inspection, researchers noticed a pattern. The symbol marked passages containing instructions for mental exercises designed to expand awareness of temporal cycles. By following the guidance in these marked sections, practitioners were able to synchronize their attention with subtle rhythms in the environment, the movement of celestial bodies, the changing tides, or even the patterns of light and shadow within the monastery itself. The triangle within the circle served as a visual cue, a nudge toward deeper perception, marginalia as a guide. Johannes's use of marginalia is equally compelling. These notes, often scribbled in faint ink along the edges of a page, appeared at first to be offhand observations or reflections. Yet detailed analysis reveals a careful layering of meaning, where each line points to exercises that blend sensory observation with contemplative thought. For example, one note reads, "Listen to the wind through the lattice. Count each distinct sound. Let each one tell its own story." Such instructions combine mindfulness, pattern recognition, and symbolic interpretation. In essence, Johannes was creating a manual for heightened awareness,
a guide to seeing the extraordinary within the ordinary. Cryptic letters and anagrams. In addition to symbols and marginalia, Johannes frequently embedded cryptic letters and anagrams within his writings. Entire phrases can be rearranged to reveal hidden messages, often instructions for meditation sequences or reflections on temporal cycles. Scholars have suggested that this was not mere intellectual play. It was a protective measure, ensuring that only those who approached the texts with patience and intention would discover the deeper truths. One particularly intriguing example involves a sequence of letters at the start of several consecutive paragraphs. When reordered according to Johannes's subtle rules, they spell out a meditation on the transience of life and the alignment of human consciousness with cosmic events. Nature as teacher throughout these hidden messages, a consistent theme emerges. Nature itself is the ultimate teacher. Johannes instructs monks to observe patterns in water, wind, and sunlight, emphasizing that wisdom can be found not only in scripture, but in the natural world. By pairing textual instructions with observational practice, he creates a multi-layered learning experience. Every page of his manuscripts becomes both a map and a laboratory, inviting practitioners to explore the intersections of mind, body, and environment. A legacy of mystery. The true genius of Johannes lies in the seamless blending of practical instruction, symbolic layering, and mystical insight. While some scholars focus purely on the historical and religious aspects of his work, others have begun to recognize the broader implications. These manuscripts function as early forms of experiential psychology, bridging the gap between ancient monastic practice and modern mindfulness techniques. By hiding his guidance within plain sight, Johannes ensures that the pursuit of understanding remains an active, engaged process. The seeker must move slowly, observe carefully, and pay attention to both the obvious and the subtle. In doing so, one gains not only insight into Johannes's vision, but also a deeper connection to the rhythms and mysteries of the natural world. Modern discoveries. In recent decades, researchers using digital imaging and ultraviolet light have uncovered additional layers of Johannes's instructions previously invisible to the naked eye. These discoveries have confirmed that his approach was highly sophisticated, combining sensory training, symbolic interpretation, and meditative practice in a system that is as intricate as it is subtle. Interestingly, some contemporary mindfulness practitioners have adopted elements of Johannes's methods, finding that the simple act of following his instructions can produce profound shifts in awareness and perception. This ongoing influence speaks to the enduring power of his hidden messages. Conclusion of section. The hidden messages within Johannes's manuscripts reveal a mind deeply attuned to the subtle interplay of language, symbol, and perception. By embedding wisdom in marginal notes, cryptic symbols, and layered instructions, he creates a tapestry of knowledge that unfolds gradually for the attentive reader. These messages are more than historical curiosities. They are practical guides for cultivating mindfulness, perception, and spiritual attunement. Johannes's work reminds us that the ordinary can hold extraordinary insights, and that careful observation, combined with reflective practice, can reveal patterns that connect us to the broader rhythms of life and the cosmos. Section 14. Reflections, Fears, and the End of the World. As Brother Johannes approached the final years of his life, his writings reveal a profound shift in tone. Earlier sections of his manuscripts are methodical, almost instructional, emphasizing hidden symbols, cryptic letters, and exercises for heightened perception. But in his later reflections, a deeply human side emerges. The monk contemplates mortality, the fleeting nature of civilization, and the fragile balance between humanity and the world it inhabits. In these passages, Johannes merges observation with intuition, turning his meticulous studies into a meditation on the impermanence of life itself. He writes about the cyclical patterns of human behavior, the rise and fall of kingdoms, and the inevitability of decay, both physical and societal. Yet he does so not to incite fear, but to cultivate mindfulness, teaching that awareness of transience can inspire careful action, compassion, and wisdom. Facing mortality. A recurring theme in these reflections is Johannes's preoccupation with mortality. He describes in vivid detail the inevitability of death, not only for individuals, but for civilizations. This preoccupation is reflected in his careful recording of omens, celestial patterns, and historical events, all woven together in an attempt to discern whether the end of the world might follow a discernible rhythm. Despite the somber content, there is a quiet calm in his writing. Rather than despairing, Johannes uses his observations to strengthen his spiritual practice, reminding himself and his readers that awareness of mortality can heighten appreciation for life's fleeting moments. By contemplating endings, one is encouraged to live fully and attentively in the present. Visions and speculations. In some manuscripts, Johannes records visions, abstract, symbolic, and sometimes startlingly vivid. He writes of fires that consume kingdoms without smoke, and waters that rise and fall in silence, carrying secrets from the past. Scholars speculate that these visions were meditative exercises designed to train the mind to perceive patterns and possibilities beyond ordinary experience. The monk's speculations are often framed as warnings or guidance, rather than predictions. He encourages readers to reflect on human hubris, environmental imbalance, and moral failings, suggesting that these are the true catalysts for calamity. The end of the world, in Johannes's view, is not merely an event to be foretold, but a mirror for human behavior, a call to live consciously and ethically. Teaching through reflection, in this final section of his work, Johannes turns inward, sharing personal lessons learned through years of observation and contemplation. He emphasizes humility, patience, and attentiveness, encouraging his readers to engage fully with the world while remaining aware of its impermanence. One passage reads, "Let the stars guide your understanding, but let compassion guide your actions, for the heavens may chart the course, yet the heart navigates the journey." This statement captures the essence of Johannes's philosophy. Knowledge of cycles and hidden patterns is meaningless without ethical application. Awareness is only valuable when it inspires care, connection, and meaningful engagement with life and others. Legacy of the monk. By the time of his death, Johannes's manuscripts had accumulated into a body of work both vast and subtle. They reveal a mind capable of intricate symbolic thought, profound observation of nature and society, and deep ethical reflection. The fragments of his writings that survive today continue to inspire those interested in history, spirituality, and human psychology, offering lessons that resonate far beyond the medieval monastic setting. His combination of cryptography, meditation, and natural observation may seem unusual to modern eyes, yet it is a system designed to enhance awareness and nurture resilience. Each symbol, note, and reflection works together as a holistic guide, not merely for survival in a physical sense, but for thriving in the mental, spiritual, and ethical dimensions of life. The calm conclusion. In closing, Johannes's life and work illustrate the extraordinary capacity of a single individual to observe, interpret, and transmit complex wisdom across centuries. His reflections on mortality, his contemplations on the cycles of civilization, and his intricate system of hidden messages offer a blueprint for mindful engagement with the world. Through his manuscripts, Johannes leaves a legacy that transcends his own time, a reminder that understanding the past, observing the present, and contemplating the future are deeply intertwined practices. His calm, deliberate approach teaches us that even in the face of uncertainty, reflection, mindfulness, and ethical awareness can provide clarity and peace. The story of Brother Johannes and his predictions about the end of the world is more than historical curiosity. It is a meditation on conscious living, By studying hidden messages, observing nature, and reflecting on human behavior, he cultivated an awareness that allowed him to navigate the unknown with both insight and serenity. Today, as modern readers explore his manuscripts, we are invited to pause, reflect, and consider how awareness, observation, and mindfulness can guide our own lives, helping us face impermanence with calm and purpose. Johannes's legacy is a quiet testament to the enduring power of careful observation, thoughtful reflection, and ethical action, offering guidance for all who seek meaning amid the uncertainties of life.